in the Infinities. Trent Fry responded in a really wonderful post where he compared Hermes to Satan. And I had this, something that I remembered from a few years ago, that in fact, if you look at the history of Satan, and Emil Paglia writes about this, Elaine, whoa, gosh, that was Elaine Pagels. I'm not remembering this correctly. Anyway, that there is this history that Satan actually originates with the trickster gods. Hermes does tricks. He says Hermes does trick humans, but ultimately wishes happiness on human beings. The second question by Katie Rice asked if Ursula's contradictory character revealed Banville's attitudes toward women or towards gods in general, which was very interesting. Corinne responded. She remarked that the question was interesting because it seemed like no one actually believed in the gods at all in the book. This shows that mythology isn't necessarily based upon what most monotheistic religions practice today. So great stuff. And what I think a lot of this discussion exemplifies sort of a high level of thinking that's going on in this class, right? We're discussing a lot of interesting topics, and they're kind of radiating out of these central texts that we're using. I kind of structured this class differently than what most people who teach mythology do, right? It's not like I gave you a Bulfinch's text, Bulfinch's mythology, in which we studied Greek pantheons, or we compared the Norse gods, right, to the Greek gods. But what I want you to do, and what I think you have been doing, which is really useful, is taking these central texts, right? Taking these these novels, and we'll get to comics right soon. Taking literature, taking other forms of media, and really kind of using those as anchors to engage in wider discussions about the importance of mythology today, which I think is a more useful project to do, right? You can look up on Wikipedia, for example, which gods are in which pantheons. So, I mean, that for me is not as important as it is to understand sort of how mythology fits into contemporary life, right? How people do or don't engage with mythos. How logos and mythos kind of interact, how they should interact, how they kind of interact in bad ways sometimes, right? So for the second half of the class, we're going to be looking at 3 texts. They're all shorter. The Infinities is actually the longest text that we'll be looking at, that we looked at in this class. So we basically already gotten through the hardest part in terms of reading, right? But we're looking at 2 comics. The first is from Neil Gaiman. It's a collection that came out, gosh, I can't remember, 2004, 2005, something like that. After his run on the sort of amazingly successful DC Comics series, The Sandman. And ostensibly, the Sandman obviously is not about real mythology, although sometimes there are real mythological characters that appear in it. The main characters are fictional, right? They're mythology that Gaiman has sort of come up with on his own. And the text that we're looking at is Endless Nights, which is a series of comics. It's sort of series of short stories, each short story focusing on a different character from Gaiman's pantheon. So that should be pretty interesting to further, interrogate this connection between fiction on the one hand and myth on the other, right? What do you do, for example, when you're dealing with a mythology that isn't even real, that is in itself sort of fictional? So we'll be looking at that. After that, we'll be reading Ali Smith's Girl Meets Boy, which is a rewriting of a myth from Ovid's Metamorphoses, the myth of Ananth. So the interesting thing about this novel is that isn't going to be as obviously about mythology at all. I mean, it's a rewritten myth, but it doesn't really reference any deities at all, right? It's just like a story. Okay. So again, this question of is it a myth when you're not dealing with any supernatural forces whatsoever, right? And we'll finish with a much more obvious um, story from Matt Fraction, a run on the Thor that he did in the I think it was started in 2008 and it ended last year. Um, and Thor is particularly interesting too, right? Because he comes out is created created um, by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. Those of you who knew anything about Jack Kirby know that he does a lot with mythology and comics, right? He not only creates Thor, but he basically creates the whole Marvel universe with Stan Lee. Marvel is a comics company that publishes Spider-Man and Iron Man, which just came out this past year. Um, so Kirby is part of that whole process. And is very interested in sort of using comics to communicate sort of mythological themes, right? Now, the comic we read isn't going to be by Lee or Kirby. It's a more contemporary comic by Matt Fraction, but it sort of you know writes the Thor comic. I mean, Thor is a superhero comic, right? It comes out and while Thor sort of has this elevated diction, it's very much a superhero storyline. He has a villain he has to fight every time. He's heroic all the time, right? He is never selfish, right? Now Fraction writes a storyline that is very much sort of in keeping with these kind of things that you would expect from mythology. Thor is a noble character, but he's also kind of snobby. He's also convinced that he's always right. He does a few things throughout the storyline which are kind of bad, to say the least. So, so we'll look at that, and we also have two projects coming up. The first being a YOLO website. I had you do an essay for the first project, but for these last two projects, I'm going to have you experimenting in new mediums. You're not going to have to write another essay. The first will be a website in which you take one of the mythological figures from either the Infinities or it's the Sandman or Girl Meets Boy, right? One of the characters, and you do research on them, meaning that you write about one or two of their central mythological stories. You talk about how they fit into the novel in which they're portrayed that you drew them from, etc. So it's going to be more of a research-based project. The final project is a poster in which you're going to present an argument in that poster, where you sort of take an ancient mythological figure that we haven't talked about yet, and sort of modernize them. Talk about how, on the one hand, in what ways they show up in contemporary culture. So again, it's a research type of project, and also talk about how they might act in contemporary culture if someone was to write a mythology about them today. So the difficulty with the poster is, of course, you're going to have a lot less room to make your point, and you're going to need to make your thesis pretty concisely. So it's going to be a very different project. So I hope that you guys are excited about where we're going for the rest of this semester. I know I am, and I look forward to seeing how you guys react to these books. These are all really interesting texts. Those of you who are annoyed by the writing of the Infinities will find Ali Smith is a very different writer from John Banville. So you may not. It's the political thing you might get annoyed with because it's a very liberal text, right? But it's a very interesting text also. So I'm not interested in whether or not you agree with it. I'm more interested in how you react to it and what you have to say about it. So So again, I look forward to interacting with you for the rest of the semester, and I will talk to you later. All right? Thanks. Bye.